So welcome, everybody. I haven't met you before, just met you. Thank you for coming out. It's nice to see everybody here on spring equinox. So we'll spend maybe the next hour or so together, talk about Russia, other things. A lot of things, of course, Russia, suffice to say, in the news a lot recently. So we'll obviously talk about these things, current Russian politics, what Russian citizens, their sort of mindset on these things based on some historical events, or recent historical events and that sort of thing. And I think I got the audio going.
Good.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Shelley.
Sure.
So just for context, I'm Brandon Chapman. Again, thanks everybody for being here tonight. I'm assistant professor of anthropology here at UAS Ketchikan campus. Been here for just about 4 years now, ending my 4th year here. So I'm still kind of a newbie to Alaska and to Ketchikan, but love it. And so just as sort of context, I've been an anthropologist and very fortunate to have been a cultural anthropologist my whole adult life, my whole sort of career since I exited college. I did a master's PhD in the discipline and then started teaching after that. And most of my research has been in sort of native subsistence, hunting, fishing, gathering, that sort of thing, various peoples across the world. I'm kind of possibly in a mid-career sort of research change, perhaps, at least a little bit. Because about the last 5 or 6 years or so, I've had through my personal life and through other means some more experience with the Soviet world, or what was the Soviet world, and more specifically with Russia within the past year or so. So there's so much going on in the news, so many important world political events, other things going on with this side of the world. I think it's very important for social scientists to be, researching things that are practically very important, and certainly for us as Americans to understand. So, in that vein, did some research here with Russian citizens and about Russia. So the title of the talk here this evening, Polny Razval. That can be that's the Cyrillic up there, the Russian term. That can be translated actually several different ways. We say here on the title, total collapse. It can also be translated like full decay, like tooth decay of the society. Polny Razval, the transition from communism to capitalism in Russia. So what we're going to be talking about generally here, and obviously we'll have questions maybe during the talk or after, obviously whatever you have to ask about this. We're going to be basically focusing sort of on the 1990s, which was a time when the Soviet Union collapsed. Some of you obviously age enough to remember that quite vividly. And then what was basically a hard transition, very hard and quick transition to privatization, capitalism, essentially, through the 90s. This was a humongous change, vast change in the society. We're going to talk about that and how it affects basically the modern Russian citizen and how they think about politics, okay? Because they experienced both, in a way, communism, capitalism, two opposite sides of the spectrum in their lifetime, some of the middle-aged and older ones today. And so how that affects sort of outlook on Vladimir Putin, geopolitics, Russian politics, that sort of thing, okay? I do have to certainly thoroughly thank who's also part of this research, my fiancée, Julia Saplakina. She's actually Russian. She's an academic like me, a social scientist, economist. She's from Rostov-on-Don, Russia, which is one of the 5 most populous cities in Russia. It's in the south of Russia, about a 2-hour flight south of Moscow. And anyway, she's an international economist, free trade, global trade, studies and lectures and teaches on that sort of topic. So we're very interested in these subjects, and so she's helped out with this research as well, so I definitely need to acknowledge her, of course, thoroughly. We have hundreds of pictures in Russia. Wanted to pick one, pick the red square one, I suppose. We have various levels of knowledge here of Russia, so I wanted to pick one that's, a site that's most, known to a lot of us, and so St. Basil Cathedral there in the background, and so this was just less than a year ago, summer of 2017, we were there, and so one of these sites, where all the tourists go and they take pictures when they go there, the Red Square, Lenin's tomb on one side, St. Basil Cathedral on one side back there, the Kremlin, Putin's residence, all that sort of stuff on the other side. The GUM, the mall, GUM, the big multi-level modern shopping space on the other side. National History Museum on the far side, facing us there in the picture. One of those places where, yes, it's got a positive history. It also has somewhat of a grim history, too. It's got, there are political opponents executed in this area, over the hundreds of years, under the Tsar, under the Soviets, other leaders. And so it's one of those places where you kind of hesitate to take a picture, because it's yes, it's a place where everybody goes and gets their Instagram selfie and all that, but if you know about it, it actually does have, in some ways, a pretty nasty history too. So this is going to be the story then, with evidence supporting it, obviously, this evening, of basically the transition and the collapse of what once was a major, geopolitical power, in some ways still is, but less so than it used to be, of what used to be the Soviet Union. And this is a map, 1989, on the eve of collapse, where we have, we talk about how big the Soviet Union was, just to remind us, how massive. This is, of course, Russia, the Soviet Socialist Republics, and all the various satellite states, we call them. The different stans of Asia, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, those places. It covered the Caucasus, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, the Baltics, all those places. So, a multi-state, multi-ethnic society brought together for basically 3/4 of a century. And so obviously it was a huge player on the world stage for much of the 20th century, of course. And, just how vast it was, basically a third of the earth almost. We forget how big Russia is. 11 times, just Russia itself, 11 time zones, almost half of the Earth in time zone form. Obviously a lot of it's Siberia, but it's just massive. So these are things we sort of need to keep in mind. We tend to think of sort of Russia and the Soviet Union as kind of monolithic, people that are kind of maybe all similar to each other, but it has a lot of variation within it. A lot of different people. So we want to sort of keep these things in mind. And so then. The transition then to what is today the Commonwealth of Independent States, what is acronym CIS. And so now, of course, post-1991, and for some other states a little bit before that, we've broken down into Russia and the various sort of more tribal groups that now have their own nation states. Kazakhstan, all the ones we just mentioned, of course, and that's the map here. So most of those old parts of the Soviet Union are in this alliance that consists currently the CIS. Okay. So I've got a ton of slides. I admit I'm going to probably skip over a lot of them because we don't have enough time to cover it all. We talk about how history sort of affects current Russian citizens' outlook on politics and outlook on things. Modern Russian history is certainly Soviet history and post-Soviet history, okay? So I'm not going to go through the entire Soviet history here because we do want to get to my research and other things. There are a lot of great books. There are thousands of pages written on Soviet history. So if you ever want to read up a little more in depth on, on the history of the Soviet Union, a lot of the Ivy League historians, Richard Pipes has written a lot of good books on it. There's a whole volumes and volumes about the Stalin era. Stephen Kofkin, he's this Princeton historian. He's just published a big thing on it recently. So I'm not going to spend too much time on the Soviet history because there's just so much written on it. We'll sort of just do a pretty broad brush picture of that, get the big picture, and then we'll go on to the 90s and then on to the research that Julia and I did. So basically, to sort of summarize, if we can, we'll take maybe a couple of slides to do that, just what the Soviet socialist era was, okay? Now, this is a pretty big statement, but I'm not the only one who would argue this. A lot of historians would, and I would certainly argue it as well. It is quite significant because, well, we could argue, at least in some measures, it is the biggest reorganization of any large-scale society in human history. Now, how do we measure those sorts of things? That's a very big statement, okay? We can measure that in a few ways, okay? Just the number of people affected by a reorganization of a set of politics, an economy, all of these things. Anywhere from 160 to 530 million. Where do we get those numbers? Well, remember the Soviet Union, we're actually just past the 100-year anniversary. 1917 was the Bolshevik Revolution, all of you remember your Eastern history. And of course, that's when the Bolsheviks came to power, Vladimir Lenin, all of that. And so basically 1917 to 1991. So 74, 75 years, 3/4 of a century, that's the time period we're summarizing and talking about. Now, the population back then starting out was about 160 million or so. That's the number of people's lives initially affected by this big reorganization into socialism, Soviet Union. 530 is basically the peak of the population when you take into account all the other satellite states, around the peak of the population in the mid to late 80s. Okay? So over a period of 75 years, hundreds of millions of lives affected by the transition into Soviet socialism. So many things. The collectivization of agriculture, moving people from private agriculture into collectivized farms. In the cities, making a whole new set of apartments, basically, reorganizing the way that people just live residentially day to day. What we see today, if you go to Russia, you go to any of these former Soviet states today, currently, what you see is most people live in these big block, what they call Stalin sort of era or Khrushchev era apartments. So these humongous buildings, all sort of similarly constructed, rectangular, square. And this is part of the humongous reconstruction, the growth in industry, the building of industry, all of these things that occurred throughout this 1917 to 1991 period. And so just the massive reconstruction, both rural and urban, the number of people affected. We can look back at long-term human history. We can see things like the Roman Empire. Yes, that was humongous, all of these sorts of things. But when we talk about just the absolute number of people affected and just the scale of reorganization of a culture, of a society, we could argue pretty legitimately this is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, in human history. So it's an important topic, certainly, to understand. Other things here, again, I'm just going to skip through some of this. We've got various, there are a lot of different periods in Soviet history. There are a lot of ups and downs. So basically, the Bolshevik Revolution starts with Lenin, 1917, into the 20s. We have a lot of, so basically at that point, everything that was private property was taken in as state-owned. Okay? This is what we talk about, the massive reorganization of the society. And this is what, even today, some Russians experienced. Private property was criminalized, and entrepreneurship was criminalized. Business activity was criminalized, literally. It was written into the legal code, law of early Soviet Union. So, we talk about socialism. We use that term today. Sometimes we use it for like Norway, Sweden, Finland, those places, some of the European countries. That's really not necessarily a correct way to use the term, if we're going to be sort of precise in our definitions. Soviet socialism, what we call true socialism, is where the state owns everything. Okay? All property, the commanding heights, industry, all business, farmland, all of these things, that's state-owned. And that's what we would call sort of socialism here, specifically Soviet socialism.
Could I ask one question
Yes.
about the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution?
Sure.
Okay.
Yes.
Wasn't that when the last Tsar Nicholas II was and his family killed, but not at the beginning of the revolution?
1917 is when the Bolsheviks and Lenin took power. And so, yes, the Tsar was removed. I would have to look back at the actual date and time when any sort of kill, when that, as that took place. But this was, as far as an upheaval for the people, a humongous thing. People that were at that time landowners, property owners, business owners. What we would call today sort of, the upper middle class, the wealthy. Their lives were, others' lives were completely tossed around too, but their lives were completely tossed around as well. Property confiscated, living quarters communalized, those sorts of things. Basically, so a lot of things. But I would have to, as far as the Tsar, specifically when the date that happened, I'd have to look. But thank you for the question. It's a very important and good question. Just to give an idea of these sorts of things, I just throw out some numbers just to give you an idea. This is in the 20s, for example, at the start of during Lenin's period and Soviet socialism. So the thing is that yes, a lot of reorganization, but also a lot of production. People's material lives in some ways got better, in some ways, in some aspects, over the long term of the Soviet Union period. This is just an example. National income statistics from the 20s, for example. You see a rise in income. You see a rise in industrial output. Some of the numbers we don't have for every single year. You know, the archives are a little, the archives that these numbers are taken from, are a little sketchy during some years, but we do the best we can. Trade, for example, goes up. We have, workers, the number of millions of workers, kind of fluctuates, but basically rises a little bit at the end of the decade. Collectivization starts a little bit. It starts in mass a lot later. The number of landowners, traders, those dealing with capital goes way down, right? That's, again, obviously the implementation of socialism, okay? Trying to equate everybody, in a society, and that sort of thing. Oh, sorry here. So again, I'm just going to skip through some of these slides and get to the 90s, more relevant to our talk here. But some things to point out. So we have this, big reorganization. What we also have, and this gets a little grim, but it is part of Soviet history, is the killings. The Holodomor, for example, one of the largest famines of modern history, that happens in the Ukraine, the early 30s. Now, these are estimated numbers. They range a good amount just because of the sources that are used, that sort of thing. About 3 to 4 million. Okay, that's the early 30s, so that's fairly early on in Soviet history. Chystka, the Cyrillic word there, the Russian word, that means cleansing, the purges. That's sort of that's like Stalin's purges, where he basically takes out political enemies that he deems as enemies. People, even within his own party, the Communist Party, are executed. That's anywhere from about 680,000 to 1.2 million. The gulags, there's a lot written on the gulags, of course. The forced labor. There were, at its height, 14 million forced labor, people forced labor in the Soviet Union. Out of that, 1 to 1.6 million of those died in forced gulag labor. So it's, it becomes a pretty rough history here too. A lot of people killed, many intentionally. Okay, so that's part of it, of course, and we have to recognize that. Yes, we had a question over here.
So the my understanding is like with the great from, I guess that the Stalin economy is when Russia's economy really went up,
Yes.
became modernized because with production of steel from an agricultural society, but it looks like it went up before Stalin took or really started efficient.
Yes.
I forget it's similar to the Great Leap Forward, but I forget what's the term for the. I can't
Well,
remember the name of
that's in
in China.
That's China.
Was copying.
Yeah. That's Chinese socialism. That's Mao Zedong.
But
Yeah,
he was.
that's a whole thing.
But I was saying I can't remember the name of what. Didn't Stalin have a name for it? For his industrialization?
There are a lot of different names for it, certainly. As far as like one sort of one that's used most often, there are multiple names. There's not one like with Mao's in China Cultural Revolution or Great Leap Forward. There isn't that sort of term necessarily for Stalin's industrial plans. Actually, the main one would be Polyevki, which are the 5-year plans, which is what Soviet industry was basically based on. These sort of 5-year plans of, okay, we're going to produce this much in each industry. Every industry is going to produce, a certain amount of things, and this is what's going to happen for 5 years.
So did overall production go up? I mean, for the people who weren't thrown in the gulags and stuff, get better.
Right. So this
versus this time period with Lenin.
Right. So this is something we should talk about too. So what did the people experience themselves besides all these sort of bigger societal things? People themselves, it varies. It depends on the person. It depends on your, even within Soviet communism, there was, it was never completely equal. That was never achieved. Let me give you an example. You take modern Russian citizens today. Nearly every Russian citizen has someone back in their family line that either knew someone or was in the gulag, or was someone who was purged, or knew someone that was purged. This is something that's deep even today in modern Russian society. There are certainly some people that had whole parts of their family line killed or purged or sent to the gulag. So it's a very serious thing, obviously. So it's the thing is with, it's a morbid thing to talk about, but with Soviet terror, some of it was even kind of random. There were charges that were brought up against people that were just suspected of spying against the nation. There wasn't really much evidence for it. It's just whoever ratted on somebody else, you could be brought to trouble in front of the party. So it's hard to sort of parse out, this demographic or this demographic is purely the ones that is being targeted in the Soviet era. There certainly were some people that were politically motivated. Those sorts of people definitely were, but but in mass, it's a harder thing to sort of get at. So,
I guess we're talking just in the overall economic sense, because
sure.
My understanding is that if Stalin wouldn't have been successful in World War II if he hadn't done that, because
sure.
It wouldn't have the production capabilities that Russia.
So the Soviet economy, like in the 40s, 50s, 60s, ration cards. This is what a lot of en masse sort of Soviet people experienced. Shortages, meaning it's not good. It's not good. Experiencing a lot of shortages of goods, being able to get basic foodstuffs, not being able to get.
In the 20s.
In the 20s, at the individual level, I can't speak as much to the 20s. I can speak more to the 40s, 50s, 60s, that sort of era, especially during the height of Stalin's period. That's a lot of rationing, a lot of shortages, certainly very much hard times for a good chunk of the Soviet population. So the 20s, I'd have to look a little bit more in depth at as far as at the individual level what the economy was doing. But it's a good. Hopefully, I answered your question a little bit. So yeah,
it's just amazing when you talk and you get pictures in your head. But I'm in my 70s, so I'm thinking of, I think it was the 60s when you would see these people on the news that were trying to purchase goods, and there just was so little. It was very interesting.
Well, if you remember the picture I showed at the start, that was actually what was a ration line in the 90s. People with milk, that's a milk ration line. When there were shortages of goods in the 90s, after the transition to capitalism, people would line up, the women and men from the rural areas, the farms would bring in milk, and they would stand in line to get milk because there was a shortage of basic goods in the cities and all of that. So we're already pretty low on time here, so I'm going to skip through a lot of this stuff because I just wanted to sort of, again, I had way too much on the Soviet history because we need to get more to more recent history. But basically, to sort of summarize then, because we want to talk about, current Russian citizens and their views on things and how these historical events affect them. Basically, what we can say is that, yes, it was obviously a humongous, important, tumultuous period, the Soviet period. It did increase productivity and basic living standards. This is, again, very broad brush, obviously. Again, if you want to read the Soviet history, there's plenty out there to read about it. And it sort of increased living standards to what we call sort of second world levels, meaning that you have these are sort of antiquated terms these days, but first world economies, developed economies, the rich nations of the world, U.S., Western Europe, Australia, Canada, those places. Third world, lesser developed countries, sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, those places. Richer economies, poorer economies. Russia was kind of in the middle. Soviet Union was kind of in the middle of those. So, second world, not completely first world level, not completely third world level, okay? So it increased, production, all these things. But it also obviously had a major price. It resulted in mass casualties. It was, this ends up being essentially the Soviet period, the second largest state-sponsored death toll in human history, behind Mao Zedong's Cultural Revolution in China, which unfortunately dwarfs this. It was a one-party authoritarian sort of terror state. It had suppression of basically almost all rights. There's no personal freedom of almost any type under the Soviet rule. And so it's, there's there are big things to weigh here. It's a very serious thing, the Soviet period, certainly. Okay. So, let me get a little more cheerful. Let's talk about the 90s a little bit. Okay. I have a few videos here to show you, so we'll lighten things up because we want to get some smiles on the faces here. So, I think you all remember the 1990s. Let me see if I'm going to have to skip forward here. So I've got a few jokes and a few videos for you.
Okay, time for some recent history. This is the 1990s.
This is the entire 1990s?
Yes.
Okay. The 1990s. How maybe we view it, weird dance crazes and bad music. Okay. Let's go more towards Russian culture a little bit. Okay. So this is getting like midway between us and Russian culture. Okay. I don't know if you remember this music video.
Can you increase the volume a little bit?
I'm sorry, the volume is low. Let me see if I can. It's back here. Anyway, this is actually this is huge in Russian culture. The Scorpions, "Wind of Change." After the fall of the Soviet Union, this song came out. It was a big hit in the United States too, in our pop charts. Yeah, kind of cheesy. We look back at it as kind of a cheesy hair band doing a serious song. But actually, he's talking about what eventually leads to this the fall of the Soviet Union, a failed coup in early '91. He's talking about walking down the Moskva River in Moscow next to the Red Square. He's talking about going and walking to Gorky Park, seeing this revolution going on. So it's actually in Russian culture. They know this song. They love it. It's humongous. People today that were kids back then, they're like, oh, the Scorpion, this song, yes, this is the 90s, So it's a connection between sort of us and them, if you will. This is a little more Russian here. This is a band called Kino. This is actually technically late 80s. This is a song called A Star Called Sun, sort of a lament about Soviet society, and sort of talking about, some of the problems of the society at that time. And it's kind of a thing, too, that Russian citizens think about when they think about the transition to capitalism. They think of sort of the Gorbachev and eventually Yeltsin era, this sort of thing. Anyway, little Russian music to lift you up here. Okay. This is also 90s. Anybody remember him?
Yeah.
Oh, you sound like a Russian.
Boris, absolute embarrassment.
Boris Yeltsin, right?
Yeah.
So this is the image of the 90s for most Russians. This event right here, this picture. This is, for those of you not familiar, of course, Boris Yeltsin, who becomes basically the leader in the transition after the collapse. So what happens? The context here. This is August '91. At that time, some of the other Soviet states had already left and abandoned communism. It was kind of starting to fall apart a little bit. And so Mikhail Gorbachev, who of course led, was leader of the Soviet Union through the 80s, he was on vacation in Crimea, down at the little, where most Russian oligarchs and presidents and prime ministers go to vacation. And there was a coup attempt while Gorbachev was out on Moscow, on the political offices there. And so Yeltsin runs to the White House, was the Russian White House, the resident of the president prime minister, and he gets atop a tank and he summons popular support to stop an attempted coup on the Communist Party. But it's kind of ironic because after this, Yeltsin basically has political power at that point. He shows he has popular support, and he gains control, and he essentially then, after that, dissolves the Soviet Union, outlaws communism officially, and we start the transition to privatization and capitalism. Very quickly, too, and very rapidly. Okay, so this is, you talk about the 90s, this image is ingrained for most middle-aged and older folks now. This is like the image of what the big transition here. And you see the Russian flag, of course, starts flying. And
But wasn't Gorbachev pretty liberal? We liked him.
yes, and I'm sorry I didn't get to the Gorbachev era because we didn't really have much time here. But yes, Perestroika and Glasnost the opening politically and economically. He allowed for some privatization in the 80s.
Yeah, so he kind of opened the way and Yeltsin took it from there.
Yes. Now, it's interesting to note, today, you poll Russian people today, the poll data shows that Boris Yeltsin is not only by far the least popular historical figure in Russia, he's probably the least popular historical figure of any society anywhere. Basically 3% positive view of Yeltsin out of, I mean, that's rock bottom. He basically can't get any lower. So it is not, cannot exaggerate this, and these are appropriate words to use, they're strong. He is hated, despised by Russian citizens today because of this, what they think of as sort of botched transition away from communism to capitalism. Okay. Why is this? Well, how is this botched? Well, just take a look at the bigger economic numbers. This is kind of the big view of basically Soviet GDP, 20th century all the way up to 2009. Well, the big dip, humongous dip, is the 90s, right? Humongous economic changes go on, humongous societal changes, okay? So you can just see it on the charts, I mean, basically, again, the Soviet era, it did increase productivity, all these other things generally. Things go way down in the 90s, okay? We can look at some other measures of this. Per capita, per adult national income. This is from 1980 to basically the present day. Russia is in the red, appropriately. And we see basically, again, this huge dip in the 90s and a recovery after the end of Yeltsin and 1999 when Putin takes power. Okay, so the 90s were a big deal. I mean, this is, again, very big set of changes that go on here. This is a nice one, too. This kind of compares the GDP to the United States. The United States is just basically the flat baseline up at the top. And this is, basically Soviet GDP. And so basically, at its height, it was basically a third the size of the U.S. economy. It kind of gives you a way to sort of think about these things comparatively. But then you start to see this big drop-off to where it's basically to almost an eighth or a ninth of the size of the U.S. economy, okay? So, big changes here. Oh, excuse me. Again, sorry, I'm not going to... want to make sure we have time for things, so... So this is what we call then the transition era, the 90s. August 91 to August 99, basically, that exact time period. And basically that's the Yeltsin to Putin era, okay? That's basically when Yeltsin rules, and then August 99 is when Putin is selected as the successor to Boris Yeltsin. This is what we call the transition era. And basically, to summarize it, it's basically a pretty rapid and near complete shift from the socialist economy and authoritarian politics to basically almost a complete privatization, open global markets, private property, and democracy within basically about 3 years. I mean, if the economy and politics are a vehicle, it's literally like slamming on the brakes and turning it 180 degrees and slamming on the gas in the other direction, essentially. It's about as hard a transition from one side of the political spectrum, an economic spectrum, to the other that we see in history. It's really quite rapid. And so this causes a lot of chaos, as you would imagine. Just a few other points on this, just to give you an example. Now remember, in Soviet times, everything was owned by the state, right? State-owned economy, okay? Privatization. Another, what is known as sort of villain to Russian citizens these days, Anatoly Chubais. He was sort of the economic advisor to Boris Yeltsin. He basically designed this private voucher program. Okay, so you've got everything, okay, so the Soviet system sort of starts falling in August of 91. You've got all these things owned by the government. How are you going to get it out and privatize it to the citizens? So Anatoly Chubais is this economic advisor. He comes up with this system, basically a voucher system. We're going to give every Russian citizen a set of vouchers, and they can use that to basically have a share of various businesses, land, other things in this, that are being basically put on the open market for privatization. This has a bit, okay, so logically, layman's standpoint, okay, that maybe sounds okay, right? That's, you're going to equally divide things among the society and make it private. Okay, maybe that'll work. The problem is that it basically ends up getting sort of rigged. This was not, a culture that's not used to privatization. People got these shares, and what happened was they basically sold them to other people. People that were sort of smart about capitalism understood it, basically bought up other people's shares, and what ended up happening was there was a lot of wealth concentration in a few hands, essentially, because people didn't know, they'd lived their whole lives under a communist sort of system. They didn't really understand what a share system was or a private system was, in sort of the more precise sense. So anyway, this happens. That's a big thing. Again, I'm just going to skip through some slides here. There are other privatization efforts. They end up going pretty bad. To put it in, this era too ends up producing what are called new Russians, or the Russian oligarchs, the billionaires. Moscow as a city has a very high percentage of billionaires that live in it, more so than almost any other city in the world. This is just a percentage here of national income that is held by billionaires in different societies in the world over time. Russia mapped against the USA, Germany, France, China, basically other major economies. And, well, the oligarchs, the billionaires of Russia control a huge amount. And this was as a result of, again, that era, the 1990s, when this privatization occurred. They basically were able to rig the system and buy up all these things under the noses from the larger citizenry. Okay, so big wealth concentration, major economic collapse, attempts at democratization, having democratic elections, and a lot of these things end up failing pretty miserably because, again, a culture that's not ready for it, a culture that's not used to it, and just really bad political planning and implementation. Okay. Again, I'm going to just skip through here to one more slide, then we'll talk about my research. Excuse me. Sorry. So then, what basically happens at the end of the 90s to bring us up to the present day, our history here, Yeltsin then, by the end of the 90s, is basically hated by most Russians, vastly unpopular. He names Putin as a successor in August of 99, and then we have, of course, the rest of the history. That's basically up to the present day. That's Vladimir Putin. Okay. So let's talk about my research then a little bit. We've got it's good timing here. We've got about 20 minutes or so left for this. So with all of this, a lot of the sort of history that's written on Russia and that we just went through, a lot of it that's written talks about sort of the politicians, the governments, economic policies, what politicians do. Very little bit, though, actually talks about what Russian citizens' outlooks on things are, okay? What they think about things. And so that's, where some of this preliminary research Julie and I have done comes in a little bit. A lot of the social science, a lot of the, those sorts of things, studies on the transition era of the 90s, sort of documents the larger sort of trends, but really doesn't talk about the Russian people themselves, okay? There are two major works that do cover sort of Russians' views and document this. One, I don't know if anybody's heard of this book, Secondhand Time. It's by Svetlana Alexievich. It actually just got republished. It's a Pulitzer Prize-winning book. It's very much recommended if you haven't seen it. It's kind of like an oral history of Russian citizens and how they think about the Soviet era and current Russian politics. So there are a few, of these sort of different works, but they're basically oral histories. So we're sort of, it would be nice to have sort of a more scientific study, a little more scientific sort of sample to try to interview, to try to understand, to try to survey Russian citizens more systematically. That's what I am as a social scientist. And so, we try to do these things scientifically and get a good sample. And so that's where this sort of research that Julie and I are doing comes in. So let me sort of preview the research questions here. So what do we want to know? So what we did was we set up basically a survey of current Russian residents, Russian citizens, age 45 and older, meaning that they were they were adults, at least 18 years old at the start of the transition. Okay, so they're basically people that are middle-aged, older people in the society today. And we had a set of questions, and some things we wanted to know is, what were the life experiences of Russian residents during this time period? Again, a lot of this talk of, well, there's a lot of documentation of what Yeltsin did, what these other politicians did. What was the actual lived experience of people themselves? Okay, so that's something we want to know. Something else we want to know is, this is a society that's experienced basically the complete failure of both communism and capitalism. They saw the collapse of socialism in the early 90s, and then basically the collapse of capitalism through the 90s. They've lived through a lot. So what are their sort of understanding of these different political systems today, after all of this tumultuousness, all of this up and down periods? What do they think of these things today? And then also about how did this era, the 1990s, did it shape in any way their views on politics in general? Okay, so that's what we're trying to figure out here. Again, let me skip ahead here. And the point is to try to get, depth, sort of insight from Russian people themselves on these sort of questions. Okay, so again, I'm just going to sort of skip through here a little bit. So what we did was we did a 30-question questionnaire survey that covers these the question areas that we just mentioned. We did this in November 2017. We did this through an online research firm. We did it online. This is actually sort of a preliminary sort of research. We're going to be supplementing it with firsthand field interviews in some various parts of Russia coming up over the next year and a half, that sort of thing. So this is kind of preliminary stuff, but we got a lot of data so far on it. We administered it in Russian, Cyrillic, so it's in obviously Russian language, and then we also had an English translation of questions next to the Russian questions, so people were obviously reading it in Russian and responding in Cyrillic and Russian. We had a translation of it. Some of the questions we asked: how would you describe the 1990s? How did the 90s compare to periods before and after that in your life? What did your salary change? Did your employment change? Did your housing change? What were the life changes going on? Okay, that was sort of the first set of questions. We had a few more questions. What is your opinion of socialism? What's your opinion of capitalism? These are sort of open-ended questions. What do you feel about these things? Are there advantages to socialism? Are there disadvantages to it? So we parsed out these questions in that sort of format and did a bunch of these sorts of things. The point here with these sort of with this sort of research is to try to get long open-ended sort of answers, not just your one or two word sort of things. Did the transition period change your view of socialism, capitalism, Russian politics and politicians, the U.S., how so? Those sorts of questions. So those are the things we asked. So let's get to, we can go past the methods here. We had 67 respondents, okay? And again, I'm just going to skip through some of the slides here because we got a lot. Basically 45 and older, okay? And we also did a thing too where, because it's an online survey, we're starting with that. We wanted to make sure that people gave, reasonably enough in-depth answers. So we had a thing where there's a minimum number of characters you have to basically answer to, that sort of thing, in order to submit the survey. And so we did that. So I don't want to get into the weeds of the methods too much because this is not my ethnographic methods class. But anyway, the methods are hopefully fairly solid. Let me show you the sample here. So this is our sample. This is where all of our respondents reside in Russia. Okay. The light yellow is basically one respondent. The orange is having two respondents in that area, that city, and then the dark is like 5 or more. Okay. So basically, what it is, it's basically where it should be. Moscow actually has a ton, 16 of the 67 were out of Moscow, and you would expect that because Moscow is 10 times the population of anywhere else. So that's pretty on par. St. Petersburg's the next biggest city. It has 6. Krasnodar down here has 5. And then all these other sort of medium-sized cities have 1 or 2 respondents. We got people all the way out in Vladivostok, China, North Korea area. We got 1 out in actually 2 out in Kaliningrad, out in that little part down by the Baltics. So it's really cool. Online research is becoming a bigger thing in the social sciences in general. There's a huge growth in studies that do these sort of online research sort of studies now. It's become a big thing the last 5 years. It's so cool because you can see by IP address where the people are responding from. It's like CIA level stuff, Like I can go down with Google Maps and I can see the apartment where my respondent, for the survey is living, literally. Like it's that, pretty cool. So like this was like in November, it's raining outside in Ketchikan. I was sitting here, getting respondents back online, and like I was, Google mapping their apartments and stuff. It's, it's kind of crazy, So anyway, the things you can do on the internet these days.
How were you able to find or advertise or find people?
Yes, the way that this is pushed out is through. Well, it's a couple different methods. The thing that we used did it through mostly through a pooled sort of survey taker set. So these different firms have people that have historically taken surveys. This is for some compensation too. So there is $5 compensation for a survey. But these are long hour and a half, 2 hour sort of surveys. So, but that's sort of hourly wage in Russia, so we pay the hourly minimum wage sort of thing, or just above that. But yeah, so that's how it's done. It's done through sort of a pooled set of survey takers, and also through advertisements, that sort of thing. You've ever been on the internet, take a survey, see on an advertisement? That was also part of this too. Okay. So, okay. We got a little bit of time. Again, all people answered in Russian. The age range of respondents was 45 to 68. We didn't get any 70-year-olds, but we were close. But kind of on the young end, it was mostly older 40s, early 50s. Okay, that's the average 52. Most were urban. That's what you would expect in Russia because almost everybody with internet access lives in urban areas. So we had 3 way out in the rural areas, but that's good though. That's what you should have. And we had a lot of different occupations, pensioners, which are retirees, a Russian term for retirees, managers, engineers, teachers, a bunch of different people. Okay, so it's a pretty, a reasonably decent sample, we would say. And we had to remove 13. We originally had 80 respondents and cut down to 67 just because some people give nonsense answers or inconsistent answers, and so you cut out the ones that are not valid, essentially. Okay, so standard social science practice. So let's get to the results here. Man, did I create a lot of slides. I need to cut down a little bit. So let's talk about life experiences in the transition for Russian. Again, this is based on the survey we did, and we're going to do interviews this coming year too. It's interesting. Basically, all respondents gave a pretty uniform description of the 90s and their outcome on the larger society. I'm going to give some example quotes here. Okay, these are sort of representative quotes from the surveys. Okay, basically those quotes that are similar to others that kind of represent the whole, set of survey takers. This is a Russian citizen here. Terrible time. Speaking of the 90s, I hope our country will not experience such horror ever again. It was a period when people lost confidence in their future. Many of them lost their jobs. Savings depreciated. Products were gone in stores. Many enterprises stopped. All these different things happening, okay? Economic troubles, horrible, horror, these sort of vivid adjectives sort of used. I hope our country will not experience such a thing again, okay? So really, almost an emotional type thing too, okay? This is a pretty common sort of type of response. Other responses. Oh, sorry, clicker's not working here. The whole system of statehood was completely collapsed. The negation of our entire history had begun, all that we were so proud of. That was very terrifying. Not all people were ready to live in the conditions of the market system, which in fact was chaos. So not only referring to the horrible collapse and what our proud country, what it once was, that's gone. Here's capitalism, market system, it's chaotic, things are getting worse, those sort of themes. The hardest is not so much in the material part, but in the moral sense. Of people with good higher education and work experience, we turned into cattle. The collapse of the enterprises came quickly. This respondent is sort of referring to, and a lot of them did this sort of thing too, where they talked about how they had once been proud of their work, and they're, these sorts of things. But in the 90s, a lot of sort of young entrepreneurs got into managerial positions and started running things, and people that were not necessarily experienced in the communist era. And so a lot of people took resentment to this. And so it's like, well, we were good workers during the Soviet era. Now we're, working under some guy who tries to make blue jeans for a profit, that sort of thing, when we were all, formally contributing to, the building of Soviet society. So these sort of sentiments. So a lot of these things, very much on Russian people's minds, how their nation was once proud and now it's not, or, it's sort of fallen from that a little bit. 90s was a real hell. Thank God that it has all ended. Okay, that's a big thing too. The 90s was terrible, horrible, a real hell, these sort of things. Okay, so really uniform. I mean, there's almost no disagreement on this. Okay, let's see here. Other things here. We had to acquire a land plot and learn how to grow safe fruits and vegetables for our family. This was a big thing during the 90s, too. We talked about the shortages. People not being able to get basic goods because of all this collapse. People would go out to their summer houses, the dachas, they call them in Russia, and start growing fruits and vegetables, to supplement food and all that sort of thing. Very common practice, okay? These sorts of things. Let me skip through here a little bit. Let's talk about some of the other things. There is, it is interesting. Most people will talk about also in their personal life failure in the 90s, that it was also personally hard for not just what the larger society experienced, but also their sort of personal failure. There is some respondents, though, although they'll talk about how Russian society was collapsed basically through that time period, but they personally actually made success during that period. That's not everybody, of course, but there is a small subset there. These are people that are usually, if somehow made it successfully in entrepreneurship and private industry. A lot of bankers would sort of, people in finance would respond this way. That their salary actually increased during the 90s, that they got actually a little better off. It's kind of a stereotype that the oligarchs and the really rich Russians, they're the only ones that succeeded during the 90s. There is certainly a subset of the larger Russian population that actually did quite well during the 90s. They're the ones that were the blue. I mean, it sounds kind of maybe cheesy to us, but the people that became entrepreneurs and made clothes and all these other things. So there is a subset there that succeeded. So that we saw that in the survey too, which is kind of interesting. It kind of goes against the larger stereotype. But there's this uniform, it's definitely a sort of model in the Russian mind that the Russian society collapsed during the 90s, and it was a very hard time for everybody. But even some of us, we did okay though. Maybe a few of us did. Let me skip ahead here. I show you some Soviet propaganda here. Lenin and Stalin, of course. This is, it says here in Russian, Stalin steering us towards communism. Communism, of course, in Marxist terms being the last stage, the ideal, the utopia society, right? Okay. Lenin, hail Lenin. Lenin is the true leader. The Marxist, the communist masterminds. I show this sort of communist propaganda to get us in the mindset here, maybe for one of the last things we'll talk about before we take questions, I guess. We're maybe about a time here. Is the level of knowledge and sort of understanding of politics and economics based on communism in the Russian mind is very vivid. This is sort of this old Soviet propaganda, the workers, portraying the workers and the posters, that sort of thing. You see Lenin and Stalin there in the background. The Soviet workers working towards a better socialist communist society. Print, the weapon of the people. Socialism, communism printed on the newspapers there. Okay, some Soviet propaganda. So what do they think of communism and capitalism after all this tumultuous periods in their history? It is amazing, and this survey really shows it that we did. There is such widespread so many Russian people know, and I can just say this from my anecdotes too, just from having been there, but it's, it shows up in the data too. I mean, it's really almost a scholarly level knowledge of communist theory. Think of us. Think of like if there was a survey of Americans in the U.S. and they asked about our economy and our politics. Nobody would be quoting Adam Smith, I don't think, about capitalism or markets or free enterprise or those. I mean, we would have general knowledge about it certainly, but in mass, most people would not be quoting the theorists of private property and that sort of stuff, which is basically our system. But in Russia, I mean, again, across the society, all education levels, everything else, people are literally at the point of quoting Marx, like scholarly level forms of knowledge. Russia is a very highly literate society, generally. They read a ton. There's a reason why War and Peace and all those books are so long. They love to read, they love to write. It's a highly literate, the education system emphasizes history and literature. So this is very literate people generally, okay? And so it shows up even in the knowledge of politics. We saw multiple times, the classic Marx quote, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. There are other ones too, even more obscure ones. I've found this too, just in my own personal anecdotes. Walking around Russia and talking to normal people, they'll have this sort of really deep, very deep, specific knowledge of Marxism and the theory and like socialism stages, and eventually, we transition into the utopia of communism and all these sorts of things. So what we're sort of saying here is that, let me get to the next part here. A few other things. There's a split on the legacy of socialism. So a lot of people will say a lot of positives about socialism, but they don't necessarily want to return to it. That's a big distinction here. Maybe one of the key few points we can end on here. So people will sort of look at it in kind of nostalgic ways. Man, we were powerful back then geopolitically. Man, we could go take vacations at the seaside. We could go, everybody had their, basic needs met, which was not always true. But, the memory can change things occasionally. And so most don't want a direct return to Soviet-style socialism. People would, when we asked them, do you want to return to socialism? They were like, God forbid. Literally, they would say that vividly, very emotionally, like, no. But some still hold, a good amount still hold nostalgia and some good memories and feelings towards it. Okay? So that's important to understand. I won't do all the quotes here because they're a little too long. There is a small minority that is nostalgic for socialism, though, that actually do want to return to it. That's, maybe, I can't do percentages because this is a small population study, but there's a small minority there that is sort of purely nostalgic for socialism, okay, that would like a return to it. What was the other point? Here's the other thing. Who is at fault for all the tumultuousness that Russians have been through? It's us. Yes. There is quite a large majority, many in Russian society. When you talk about politics, they have vehemently bad attitudes towards the United States, geopolitically, about our politics and what we do in the world.
Is that because Gorbachev came and liked it here, and even what is it, the other one, Khrushchev,
Nikita
his
Khrushchev.
visit?
It's a lot of things. It's an excellent question. It's a complex question. It kind of has a complex answer. It's multiple historical events. They see that when they talk about the transition. First of all, they see that. Well, let me give you a quote. Actually, I'll do that a little better. Okay. The West really liked the weak Russia of the 90s. Again, this is representative. This is common of what a lot of people said. Their advisors did a good job of breaking down the state and financial system, the collapse of medicine and education industry, the army, basically everything. This respondent's talking about Russia, obviously. Almost conspiratorial in a way. Understand that Russia is one of the most effective media propaganda states in the world. Anybody familiar with RT? Russia Today? RT America, there's an American version of this. They have headquarters in Washington, D.C. You turn on Russian television, and it is about as anti-American as you can get. Most outlets, not all, but most, the major ones. Okay. So you ask, let's take another recent example that you may know of. Crimea. So Crimea is that little area between Ukraine and Russia. It was annexed by Russia back in 2014, 4 years ago. You ask most Russians why that occurred. They would say that Russia had to take it because we were going after it and wanted it ourselves. Not correct. but the U.S. is scheming and doing these things, okay, behind the scenes. Okay. Now, again, that's obviously not everybody. We're speaking in generalities here, okay, larger picture. But it is a fairly widespread held opinion, okay. Let's see. Let's do maybe one more point here. Let me skip to the end. Let me kind of summarize things. There are a lot of slides here. Let me skip the last slide, sort of summarize this for you all. Then we can take questions. How does that sound? Because I wanted to sort of make a point here at the end. This last slide. The reason why, if we can explain Vladimir Putin, our friend Vladimir Putin. Recent poll data on Putin, it's kind of hard to get at exactly how many Russians support him or sort of accept Putin, like what the active support is, okay? But generally there's a fair amount of support, and there's also a lot of what we would call passive acceptance of Putin, meaning that they don't actively support him, but they'll maybe vote for him, or they'll just put up with it, the sort of dictatorial measures and all these other things. Because, a lot of this has to do with the 90s and these historical experiences. Think about it. A people that have experienced, again, the collapse of a major society, have lived through it, the Soviet Union, again, capitalism coming in, privatization, collapse of that. If something replaces Putin, it could be a lot worse, right? We've experienced all of this, these tumultuous eras before us. This is kind of sort of the wider spread thing, because a lot of Russians will tell you, and will tell you in detail, how corrupt Putin is and how corrupt the regime is. They know it. They have deep knowledge of this. They understand it. But they will basically passively accept Putin, not everybody, but a fair amount of the population, because of these historical experiences. Okay, does that make sense to folks? So that's kind of what we found in the end. Again, sorry, I didn't mean to skip through so much and bombard you with a lot of things. We had a lot of data here from this and did a pretty huge survey here. So there's still a lot to parse through. But that's basically the sort of message we got from all of these sorts of things. A really deep knowledge and understanding of communism, nostalgia for it, but not wanting to return to it. Really bad negative outlooks towards capitalism, privatization, and those sorts of things in general. Not everybody, but in general. And then this is why then we have this sort of passive acceptance of Putin, is because of these previous tumultuous periods of history. So I guess that's about it. Where's the last slide? I gotta say thank you. Where is it? Somewhere. There it is. Spasibo. Thank you. This is me in front of at Red Square. That's the big Russian National History Museum there. So thank you very much. We can take questions, or if you're not all tuckered out or sleeping or anything, we can talk a little bit. Because again, there was a lot there, and I didn't have time to get through all of it, of course. So. Yes?
That music you showed made me wonder how much freedom of speech they had at that time and how much they have now, and how the transition of freedom of speech worked.
That's an excellent question. This is something we actually explicitly asked at the end of our survey. The last two questions we did in our survey, we asked during the Soviet period. I can't remember it off the top of my head exactly. I'd have to look at it. But it was basically a question about, during the Soviet era, did you feel comfortable talking about politics in public or with your family, friends, that sort of thing? And then we asked a question today, currently, do you feel comfortable talking about politics in public, in the home, that sort of thing, okay? And we still have to sort of analyze that stuff because we focused on the other bigger questions. But most people are comfortable talking about politics today in public. I mean, to get in trouble in Russia today talking about politics, you would have to basically go and, yell anti-Putin stuff at a top official to get in pretty serious trouble. Or you would have to organize some big public protest. That's when or you're some sort of oligarch or political opponent. Then you get poisoned.
Yeah.
But if you're just a citizen, just somebody, or just a Russian, not politically connected or anything else, people talk about politics, pretty out in the open, fairly routinely. It's not that dangerous or anything. If you're a serious political opponent, seriously rich, have political aspirations, then you got to watch what you say. Or if you're, seriously again, you'd have to, as a normal Russian citizen, you have to go and do something pretty serious to get pushback from serious pushback from somebody.
You didn't feel people were watching you and everything you did?
Oh no! So I've had experience in Moscow, Rostov-on-Don, some places in Russia, and other parts of the former Soviet world too. And I mean, people will in restaurants and out in general public places, they'll talk about Putin. They'll tell him I don't like him.
So there wasn't a KGB guy following you everywhere?
No, I'm the guy on the computer following everybody. No, I'm just joking. No, it's not that sort of thing. So we really need to dispel this myth too. This is not some sort of, yes, during the Soviet era, you talk about the old days. I mean, people would rat on other people. That was during the bad times. That was when people were listening to other people, and that was bad. Now, since Putin, it's not like everybody's listening to everybody else. People are pretty free to speak their mind, generally.
Yeah.
You and then.
No, I was just going to say on the news that my husband and I listened to, they did have some students talking about Putin in Russia. And they, my husband was real curious because they seemed comfortable to make criticisms about him. So this is good to hear you confirm that.
Well, it's good for Russian folks, hopefully too, right? Yes. Again, there's not.
Yes.
So there is suppression of speech when it's massively organized. Generally, you can go to Moscow, and there are like anti-Putin film festivals being put on by groups, and they're not shut down. So again, it's got to be. You organize a mass public protest. Or you're somebody really well connected and a political opponent. Then it's serious. Then you get poisoned, you get that sort of stuff. But generally, for other Russian citizens, no, they generally will freely talk about things and their opinions. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. You want to go here first, than her? Either way.
Sure. Okay. How easy is it for you to go back and forth? Because I was told you need visas.
You need a visa.
And
yes.
I was in St. Petersburg about 2 years ago, and I felt a real surveillance attitude.
The Kremlin, by the way, Kremlin gates. So you need a visa. It's one of the few societies that America needs a visa to go to. They relaxed their visa standards back in 2012. So the last 5 or 6 years, I've got a 3-year multi-entry visa easily.
Oh.
It's good for 90 days at a time. Anybody with criminal record, you can get one, essentially, or any other serious thing. So it's been laxed in the past 5 or 6 years. So travel is easier. I mean, it costs a few $100s. You got to put some money in to get the visa, but Russian government's got to make their money somehow.
Can you fly in anywhere or just to Moscow with your visa?
You can fly anywhere, and it's good for all of Russia. Now Crimea is a completely different story. That's been annexed since 2014. That's still a kind of a no-go area. It's very still much up in the air how you travel there as a foreigner, but generally everywhere else it's pretty much fine. So I'm sorry, I didn't mean this.
Well, I'm ready.
Skip over here. Okay, go ahead. You first, because I'm sorry.
It seems to me like, sadly, Russia has become corrupt to its core. And the word kleptocracy is often used in the news to describe what's going on. And that if somebody like Putin retains power to protect those who are basically fleecing the country of its capital, its wherewithal, its riches, its even currency. There's some discussion in the news about how there's a tremendous amount of just flight of capital from the country, and that bleeding a country like this, aside from just how sad it is, when you consider Russian history, it seems to me like it's just it's a powder keg. It has the potential of being something where you so aggravate a nation of people, regardless of how inured they are to suffering, that the anxiety that people have about Russia, other than within Russia, must be fueled by this impending sense, notwithstanding the corruption, just like I said, to its core, but that it is a gangster regime. It is like the kind word for it is kleptocracy. It's sort of like a euphemism for what's really going on, which is theft on a scale that only the collapse of the Soviet Union could have afforded. And that's what makes it. You talk about these things in history that are so precedent-setting. I think the precedent that we are about to see coming in the future, coming from Russia, will eclipse anything that you've described.
Should we take a poll on Vladimir Putin? No. By the way, this is KGB, in front of the KGB building in Moscow. I had to get that picture. So to address I agree with much of that, definitely. Again, Russians themselves, they will thoroughly outlay for you the corruption. They know it. They know it's a kleptocracy, generally. They understand that pretty thoroughly. Some of the biggest things in their daily life is, how do I get the government to do something? I got to bribe everybody. They know this. They've experienced it daily. So they know these things. But again, so why the acceptance of somebody like Putin, who oversees that sort of stuff and obviously acts within it and acts that way as well, as a kleptocrat, as a sort of minor authoritarian,
the keeper of the secret.
Well, but it's also, again, there are these sort of other factors involved too. No, I agree with a lot of what you've said. But again, there's a lot of passive acceptance of him too. And it seems to be because of some of these historical failures. It's also a survival mechanism. What's going to happen if Putin goes down? And Putin brought security. Now, I'm not making an argument. I can give my own opinions about Vladimir Putin.
Security is that, right?
Well, but think I'm trying to speak from the Russian viewpoint here generally. Yeah. Putin brought, after a crime-ridden. The 90s, people were getting shot on the streets in the 90s. That was a common occurrence. The mafia took over because of the economic collapse. The government couldn't provide services. The mafia came in. That's where the Russian mafia kind of comes from, is the 90s. It was a tumultuous, crime-ridden period. Putin comes in, cracks down on all of that, brings security. Security is a big thing with Putin. And so he also, here's the other big thing, he brings up the national identity of Russians. I can't make you rich necessarily, but I can make you proud, that sort of thing. I can make you feel Russian. I can make you feel proud of our society on the geopolitical stage. Look at what they're doing to us. To imagine 3 years ago somebody saying the Russians are going to partially take over Facebook, push out ads, and maybe partially affect the presidential election in 2016. Could anybody have predicted something like that?
I don't think so.
Definitely not. And so it is amazing that this strategy has worked, even to the level that it has. And so these are the things that Russians will point to and say, look, I mean, I know this is bad stuff. Obviously this is horrible sort of stuff, but it's a sort of proudness of we're somebody on the world stage again. That national identity is a big part of this too. Poll data will show that. Russians are very proud. When Crimea was annexed, 20-point increase in pride. I mean, it was like off the charts.
Like the Cosa Nostra is the pride of Sicily.
Well, yeah, but it's this idea that, okay, now we're getting back what was once ours, you know. And yes, that's a horrible thing to say from an outsider's, but it's, you know, that's certainly what some Russians think, you know, national identity. Yeah. Question, and then.
Yeah, could you speak about migration? Because there seem to be a lot of Russians who do want to migrate out of Russia, especially from Ukraine, but other areas as well, and how easy to do that is that to do?
It's not easy. So a lot of that, again, happened in the transition because the Soviet, you know, during Soviet times, you couldn't travel out, essentially. You had to be somebody. So there was a lot of mass migration in the 90s. Mm-hmm. Russian population went down in the 90s. It didn't grow, it actually decreased. Because of the economic times, people weren't having kids and people were migrating out. Mm-hmm. So that happened a lot back then. It continues to happen at a slower rate. The Ukrainian thing is really bad because, you know, there's still war going on in the Donbass and on the eastern side of Ukraine with Russia. So yes, I mean there's still some you know, folks wanting to migrate out, but it's not en masse or anything. Most Russians are generally proud of their country and want to stay there. It's definitely not an en masse sort of thing these days. Ukraine's a completely different story. Mm-hmm. But Russia, you know, Russians generally want to stay there and live their lives and, you know, maybe not talk so good of Putin, but they'll live their lives, you know. Yes, in the back.
I've heard the saying that each generation, each person is a product of their own era, or their generation. And some of the citizens that were upset with capitalism because they were indoctrinated in the system of communism, and communism took care of certain things. There was order in some sense, and with that collapse, and then the collapse of capitalism and stuff, you know, it showed that they can see that, you know, all systems were inherently corrupted. You know, things are going to happen, and of course, you know, it'll happen. And with the collapse of those two eras is the excitement and uncertainty, but then again, we have a chance as a country to reinvent ourselves all over again.
I wanted to try to find, maybe end on some data too that sort of spoke to your point, and it's a good point. Some things here, this is just poll data. Do you think Russia needs democracy? Look, you know, people are generally, you know, yeah, democracy, okay, that'd be cool. You know, over 50% will generally say that. Like, yeah, let's do democracy, okay. You know, but what do you think is more important for Russia now? Order or democracy? Oh, order. Man, security and order, 70, 80%, you know, big chunk, right? Mm-hmm. So when you just ask about, like, democracy, oh, yeah, democracy's great. What's more important, order or democracy? Oh, security and order is more important, okay? So this is where, you know, what's the most important thing right now? And based on what you kind of say too, maybe our recent experiences. It's security, it's order. No more crime. Make sure we can just live our lives as Russians.
And a lot of the people have become disillusioned after seeing the collapse of these two great powers. You know?
Yeah. And let me make another point too. Russians, I talk kind of bad about Russians' attitudes towards geopolitics and the West and us. Like, you know, they really almost conspiratorially think about the United States in that sort of way. Obviously, Russian people and American people, they generally love the American people, of course. I mean, that's about the politics, the world event. So I want to make that clear if I didn't make that clear, obviously. You know, I mean, as an American, go to Russia, you know, people are as warm as anybody else. They like the American people. They like a lot of our, you know, media. I mean, not media, but entertainment. You know, that sort of stuff, as many people around the world do. But it's about the geopolitics, what the United States politicians and our system and all that sort of bigger stuff is doing. That's where they get negative, essentially. So,
My
yeah.
last question.
Sure, of course.
But how do they feel about China and how China is becoming an economic power?
Man, I'm glad you brought up China. The Chinese tourists in Moscow are everywhere. It's like a 10-to-1. Like there are 10 times more Chinese tourists than any other type of tourist in Russia. You go to Moscow these days. It is humongous Chinese tourist groups everywhere. Communist nostalgia tours for China. Yep.
Oh.
Seriously, red tours they call them. They're a whole. Seriously, how ironic is this? There are whole private companies set up today in Moscow, out of Moscow, that give communist nostalgia tours to Chinese tourists.
Oh my.
Yeah, because that's their history, though. For Chinese, they went through Mao and they're a socialist too. So it's like they're going to their neighbor to see how they did socialism and kind of reflect on, hey, wasn't this cool?
What's the difference?
Yeah. So so the whole China. I mean, as of today, like the things going on today. I mean, that's a kind of off and on sort of relationship. It's not necessarily my area of expertise, so I don't want to speak too much to it. But look, I mean, China's essentially an authoritarian capitalist state. Essentially, I mean, you can't. The party's called socialist, but that's not correct. I mean, in any way anymore. It's an authoritarian party, though. It's a one-party system. So I mean, look, both Putin, China, they all play everybody else whatever way they need to play them to get what they want. Doesn't matter who they are. So if Russia's doing something they don't like, they'll play Putin the way they want to. If us and Trump is doing something they like, they'll play him the way they want to. All that sort of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I mean that's what these people like Putin, authoritarians or partial authoritarians do. If they want a Democrat to win the next election, they'll make ads bad about the Republican. They want the Republican to win, they'll make bad ads about the Democrat. Period. They don't care who it is. They just want what they want at any given moment. So that's the general strategy.
How dense were we to allow all that? Yeah.
Well, I would make the argument. I think a lot more people today would make the argument. I would make the argument, and this is controversial, but I would not say that North Korea is our biggest adversary. I'd say Russia's our biggest adversary in the long term. North Korea, yes, they have they're going to have the nuclear capability, but that's not going to be. I mean, nukes are not going to be used. Russia is a serious long-term adversary geopolitically. They have the way we communicate on the internet now, and are going to continue to do that, and that's only going to they know this stuff. There are little agencies in Moscow and Petersburg that's go out and think of it this way. You've read comment sections on YouTube videos or things like that on the internet, maybe blogs or something. Kind of a cesspool of everybody making pseudo-racist comments and all these other weird things. A lot of that is most likely Russian bots. We tend to look at those things like, man, how could people write this sort of stuff? It's actually probably not real. A lot of it's probably not real people. A lot of that sort of cesspool sort of commentary we see online is we're finding out more and more. It's almost certainly a lot of just bots talking back and forth and trying to create chaos. That's what they're doing. They're trying to sow discord and doubt about ourselves and all these sorts of things. And in some little ways, we're starting to take the bait a little bit, as a society, a little bit. It's not massive yet, but it could get that way if we don't, make these things a serious priority, I would say. So I would argue that my argument is Russian people, wonderful, love them. Russian politics, watch out.
Love their propaganda.
Well, does anybody know Russia Today, RT? It's. I mentioned it earlier. If you ever have a chance, don't spend too much time on it because it'll make you go maybe a little crazy after a while. But check it out. It's an alternative view of things. Kremlin funded, Kremlin backed. It has offices. They have an RT America out of DC. Some old folks that used to be on our networks, like Larry King, I believe, and others have appeared on those places that still want to make some money somewhere. So it looks kind of legitimate, you know? So, you know.
They're not going to infiltrate into our personal computers if we go online just to check out.
No. But they will try to infiltrate your minds and your opinions, you know, that sort of thing. So
what is the target of RT? I mean, is it typical Americans or is it other?
Yeah,
subset?
it's to become a legitimately looking news organization, just like CNN, MSNBC, or the others. Yeah, it's funny.
The UFC, they don't seem like it's very. It doesn't seem like very good propaganda.
Here's a funny story. Moscow Airport, Sheremetyevo. It's the big airport, and they have 3 major airports. Sheremetyevo is the biggest. Julie and I are sitting down. We're going back to the States after our time in Moscow last summer. There's basically 2 gates in Sheremetyevo that have the New York flight, the American flight, essentially, to the United States. You sit down at the gate, and right in your face is the big 70, 80-inch monitor blaring RT at you. Like they've put... Just a coincidence, they put it right at the gate where, you know, the United States flight always is. They're like, you know, they're pushing propaganda, you know. That's, you know, trying to make the Americans, you know, that are traveling back from Russia, you know, Russian politics, you know, that sort of thing. So, you know, this is all strategic, you know. So it's some important things to maybe think about. So.
Pardon me for interrupting. We're going to close because it's 8, but we can continue
Of course.
afterwards. Yeah.
Yeah. That's a question, I guess.
So, I guess the Russians weren't in, and I'm assuming it. I don't know why Yeltsin, why he did such a bad job at, or felt. I heard it was like there's something with the World Bank that he had to do.
Why Yeltsin was so mismanaged stuff.
Why he made such a hard turn
Right.
as opposed to taking it slower and gradually. But
yeah. Well, you know, think about the situation. I mean, you're coming out of a system that, again, everything is state owned essentially. What are you going to do? I'm personally not prone to the Yeltsin critiques too much. I mean, he wasn't the best certainly, but it's in a little ways it's almost kind of Monday morning quarterbacking. I think in a little bit, it's a very hard situation to go into politically. I mean, you're talking about a collapse of a whole system. You're talking about needing to privatize at least some of it. Yes, it was probably done way too rapidly.
He was absolutely the least competent person to do it.
He was. You can make an argument. He certainly was not competent. Yeah. No, I'm. What I'm saying is that it's not an easy situation by any means. This is a historically anomalous sort of situation. A lot of people would have failed out. Maybe not as miserably as Yeltsin. Sure, I can certainly agree with that. But it's generally a tough thing.
So it's like Russia lost. I mean, so Russia lost a lot of political power as well as economic then, and now my understanding is Putin's trying to build back the, Russia's importance in the world, but at a cost of the economy. And how does that play out in the long term in Russia today? How do people view that in Russia today?
What was the last thing anybody? What did you all buy from Russia recently? Anything?
The doll.
A Matryoshka doll? Oil? Anything else?
Oil.
No, probably not. They don't produce anything. I mean, for the global market, they don't produce much else. Besides, it's an oil economy, primarily, and that's about it. And so goes oil. So does the Russian economy. That's why they're in a stagnation right now, and their economy's taking somewhat of a recession because oil prices went down. So they've and when they got out of the Soviet Union days, they realized that a lot of this stuff was just not valuable in the global market. The currency went to the global market, their goods went to the global market, and it plummeted immediately. People lost their savings overnight, literally. I mean, the currency just plummeted on the world market once it hit because nothing was valuable to the rest of the world that they were producing. I mean, it's a very sad story to tell, but that's the economic reality of it.
I thought they were a heavy resource-rich country.
Well, there are a lot of natural resource-rich countries in the world. I mean, that don't economically do well just because commodity prices fluctuate a lot. It's very unstable. Again, there's certainly oil there. That's their primary wealth generator.
Takes money to develop the resources too.
Of course, yeah. So it's it's kind of a juxtaposition. There are a lot of resource-rich countries that are very poor generally, just because it can be captured by a few. It can be mismanaged. Commodity prices are inherently unstable. So
other than Putin trying to stay in, I guess my question is, other than Putin trying to stay in office, which it helps him, like interfering with our elections and stuff. Since we don't have a lot of direct trade with Russia per se, except for the sanctions
for the oil,
we impose
except
on
for,
them, for them wanting maybe investment vehicles.
Yeah.
Other than, is the purpose only to keep up national pride, or is there a longer term economic strategy trying to gain global influence?
It's an excellent question. So Putin's strategy seems to be, early on it was more about economics, because the economy was generally better when he took power, and in those some of those early and mid session of the years that he's been in power. But now it's more about national pride, and that's why one of the reasons probably why Crimea was taken was because the economy was starting to go down, and we need to take back some land to bump up our pride, our national pride, and it worked. I mean, it's horrible to say, but you look at the poll data, it worked. So
it's a short-term goal. It's not a longer-term goal, like trying to gain influence for.
Well,
Putin
would love to put back the Soviet Union, certainly geographically the way it was, but they don't have the capability to do that. I mean, that takes a ton of money. They don't have the resources to do that.
I mean, do they get any? It seems like they're
doing just what they can
economically, but so he could.
They're doing what they can.
Okay.
They take Crimea, which is a small piece of land. They war in eastern Ukraine. I mean, look, Ukraine is one of the poorest nations in the world. Basically has almost no military. Russia can't even take a third of it right now, legitimately. So it does not have the capacity to rebuild geographically what it was. But Putin's strategy is create chaos, cut other people down. That's the strategy, really, to summarize it. To cut other nations down. To cut us down, to make us doubt ourselves through, propaganda and that sort of stuff. Very cheap. Get people on the internet and do it. And then take back a few pieces of land, make our people a little more proud, what we can muster with our military.
So it's not like, to make an analogy with China, like our conflicts with the South China Sea with trade, them trade routes.
China has tons more economic resources than Russia does.
So it's not a long-term goal
China, right? Russia
is just to keep in power. It's not to build.
Right.
It's not to build economic power in the long term.
Well, I mean, they would like to, but they don't really have the capacity.
Okay.
So that's China's capacity. They can do that.
Yeah.
Russia they don't really have the capability right now to do that. So it's just we're gonna try to cut everybody else down politically and take a few pieces of land when we can. And that's generally the strategy.
Okay. So the sanctions haven't been hurting them.
Well,
and all that stuff.
I can't speak to how much the sanctions have hurt or not hurt. That I would have to look at that. That's
okay,
not. I can't speak to that.
I guess I heard that their economy has gone down recently since.
Yeah, and I don't know. There are recent sanctions put onto, and I don't know this. I'd have to look at the particulars, but it's a good question, though. Yeah.
I might not have heard it all, but did you say that we went into Crimea, or he went into Crimea because the U.S. was going to go in there?
What I'm saying is, you ask many Russian citizens why about Crimea generally. Many Russian citizens, not all, there would be a good amount, using general terms here because I don't know the specific percentages, would tell you that we had to do that because you guys were going to take it.
And was that Putin's?
That's a Russian propaganda, anti-U.S. sort of meme, if you will. We have eyes towards. We had eyes towards Ukraine. No, I don't think we did. but there are a good amount of Russians that would think that.
wasn't the door that opened up that rationale trying to entice Ukraine to join NATO?
Well, that would be the things
By
that they
luring,
use.
luring
Right.
Ukraine away into the graces of the West.
Right. It's not really anything specific. It's just like, well, Ukraine is westernizing, and these are the things that they would
Right.
cite in their propaganda to make you think that. Right. Sure. Well, hopefully not all doom and gloom. So.
No,
No,
very,
not-
very interesting.
So-
Thank you very much, Dr.
Yeah.
Chapman, for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you guys. Thanks for coming out. Good to see you all. Hope you had fun.